introduce to you Dr. David Floyd.
Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, so the talk is Manifestations of a Mystery. And essentially what I'll be doing is taking a look at, I explained this a little bit last night, is sort of looking at different Bigfoot types of things that have appeared throughout history, just to kind of look at the consistency of this thing and how it just crops up over and over and over again. And I'm not necessarily reading Bigfoot into everything, but it's Bigfoot enough to consider. So we'll just go with that. So as far as what I want to do today is, first off, talk about how I got into Bigfoot research in the first place. And then I want to take a look at other researchers that take a look at folklore and historical, mythological sources and that type of thing. And then take a look specifically at 3 different manifestations of Bigfoot type stuff, the hairy man, the green man, and the wild man. And then I want to go through a really brief timeline, starting all the way back to ancient Greece, all the way up to where we are now, and just show how this pops up over and over again. So I teach English and British literature and composition, and so the works that I deal with are things from my area of specialization is the late 1800s British fiction. And this is a lot of in genre fiction, which is stuff like Gothic literature and imperial literature, adventure stuff, children's fiction, that type of thing. And it's a lot of stuff that's still with us today, even though it was written 150, 200 years ago. And so I teach things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Invisible Man, Dracula, this kind of stuff that's still very much with us today. And stuff that has to do with monsters and that type of thing. The ghost story really got going during this period, the Victorian and Edwardian periods. And so I'm sort of steeped in that kind of stuff all the time anyway, monster type things and ghosts and Gothic kind of thing. And also, along this period, you get Treasure Island, King Solomon's Mines, these kind of adventure novels that have to do with going out into the unknown to look for stuff, and that type of thing. And then Sherlock Holmes comes along during this period, and you've got Heart of Darkness is published right toward the end of this period. And all these books having to do with finding mysteries and that type of thing, figuring out mysteries and all that. So it's not too far of a jump to teach late Victorian British fiction to study things like Bigfoot. And I found that anything that I wrote or published or presented tended to not only think about literature, but also the historical moment that it comes from. And so sort of half of my lecture when I teach literature is talking about the historical context that produced it. And so I'm really interested in history and that type of thing, which led to my next hobby, which is a PhD in cultural history, which I'm working on. And the reason I mention this is cultural history as opposed to general history or military history or economic history. Cultural history looks at the way cultures express themselves through literature and art and folklore and mythology and all this, and how they're these small cultures, they call it micro-history, looking at small cultures. This room is a micro, we could do micro-history on this group because it's a culture of its own, with its own lingo. If I say Patterson Gimlin, you know what I'm talking about, but if I go down the street, it might be, what are you talking about? And so cultural history looks at that type of thing. And so the way this sort of determines my trajectory as far as studying Bigfoot, and sort of looking at the way these different cultures throughout time have referred to this creature. And so that's what I want to do. When I teach composition, I'll talk about, if you're going to use some terms that people might not necessarily know, make sure you define your terms. And so most of us in here know what cryptozoology is, the study of hidden animals. And it's got at least 2 different definitions, one of which is the study of creatures once thought to be extinct that may still exist. And this is the one we're really familiar with, like the coelacanth and possibly the plesiosaur, if there's a Loch Ness monster, that type of thing. But the second definition is the one that really interests me. Creatures in myth and legend and folklore that are actually based on biological reality. So you have something like Goatman or a werewolf or an ogre and that type of thing. And the idea that these things, I believe somebody was talking about this last night, that anytime you have stories like this, it's going to be based on something biological or something in reality, even if it kind of accrues some weirdness along the way. For example, you have this fellow with the name Sir Harry Johnston, who was a British explorer and writer in the Victorian period, and he's talked about the Neanderthals. He says the dim racial remembrance of such gorilla-like monsters with cunning brains, shambling gait, hairy bodies, strong teeth, and possibly cannibalistic tendencies may be the germ of the ogre in folklore. So there automatically you have this idea that these proto-humans or whatever existed alongside the people that came up with these mythology. You know, they'd see a Neanderthal walking around in the woods or whatever, and then come up with a story of an ogre. So also in my composition classes, I tell them if you're going to write a paper or doing something, you need to make sure you have a clear thesis. So just to be clear, what I'm talking about here is there's significant mythological folklore, cultural and historical evidence to support the idea that Bigfoot-type creatures not only preceded, but coexisted and continue to coexist alongside the human race. So I do believe they're out there. Now I want to take a look at some other people that have approached this topic from the same place. One is Bernard Hoyfelmans, who wrote On the Track of Unknown Animals in 1958. And in talking about cryptozoology, he said it should be interdisciplinary, not just scientific, but he recommended employing the biological sciences, ecology, linguistics, history, and art history in a holistic approach. And this is the way I look at about anything, you know, whether I'm studying Bigfoot or literature or whatever, you sort of have to get all the pieces of the pie to get the whole picture. You know, that's what I think is really important. He says, in addition to the use of science, exploration of cryptids should involve consideration of folkloric information as well. And he says that stories, just like Johnston just said, that stories about these creatures contain a residue of fact. Another sort of hero in this world is Ivan Sanderson, who wrote Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life, which I believe Russell has a copy of that. Yeah, so go see Russell. And he's credited for coining the term cryptozoology. And he would actually search through medieval texts for references to Bigfoot-type creatures, which I think is kind of cool. And he said that that medieval folklore was not merely symbolic, but that it's actually referring to real creatures that these writers would see, and that if you read about these creatures in medieval folklore, it's actually evidence of these things walking around that coexisted with the author. A French art historian named Liew, who wrote Religious Art in France in 1913, he says medieval sculptors did not invent the figures that they created, but rather copied what they saw, which is a really bold claim considering you see two-headed dogs and griffins and gargoyles and that. But it's all over the place. It's not just in Salt Fork or here or wherever. You know, you've got in North America, just about every state, you know, as has been said previously, you know, whether it's the Florida skunk ape or the fountain monster, Momo, you know, and then on to, you know, the Australian yowie, Central Asian Alma, all these ones that we're very familiar with, you know, the Yeti, of course, Japanese have the Hugabon, Chinese Yeren, Indian Mandip Baru, Pakistan and Afghanistan has a Brahmanu, So these things are everywhere, you know. And these are names you're probably familiar with already. But what I want to do today is kind of go into a couple of different things that you've probably heard of, but just maybe get into a little more depth, which is the hairy man, the green man, and the wild man. So the hairy man is one of the many names that the Native Americans used. They have ancient people, stick people, bush Indians, stone man, tall man, you know, all these different names for this creature. You might be familiar with Kathy Strain. She actually works with Native American people, and she wants to collect all their oral traditions and get them into print to preserve them, you know, because they're dying off, or they don't, you know, pass them down like they used to. So she's working to try to get them in print. And she talks about that in her books, Giants, Cannibals, and there's sort of two types of the wild man, the sort of eccentric loner and that lives in the wild, and then you have the more sort of violent man-beast type. You've got the loner in the wild. This is sort of the eccentric loner. This is a human being who just is either very lost or maybe abandoned as a child, maybe raised by animals. There are several different accounts of wild men from the 1912 Norfolk, Virginia pilot. This one swamp dweller. The hermit who lives there is a friendly, short man with unshaven face and unshorn mass of gray hair. He speaks an unintelligible gibberish. He was dressed in the most inconceivable assortment of cast-off clothing, each garment ingeniously patched and mended until little of the original cloth remained. So you've got guys like that are just guys that live out in the woods, you know, not really harmful or anything like that. But then you have other guys like this one from 1899, the Wild Man of Wisconsin, who's very difficult of approach, so you don't want to mess with him, and capable of insane fury. So if anybody came near him or near his stuff, he would freak out on you. Another one is the Daily Argus News from Kokomo, where they encountered a queer specimen of humanity who fought like a demon. Of course, they were trying to capture him, which is always a no-no. He's a Hercules in physique, and he's covered in thick, shaggy growth of grizzly hair. This is an artist's rendering of, evidently, when they tried to capture him, he was initially on 2 feet, but then when they went to chase him, he got on all fours and scurried away. And then finally, we have the Ochisi Pond wild man from Florida. He's a fellow that was seen in 1883-84, who would sort of keep to himself, but he would kind of scream at night. So evidently in 1883, some Confederate soldiers decided to capture him. Supposedly he was captured, but there's no reports of his fate. They either always escaped or nobody finds out what they did with him. Sort of the more fun type of wild man is the violent man-beast that is not human, or at least not entirely human. And you see these a lot in medieval art and that type of thing. Richard Bernheimer states that medieval literature is shot through with the mythology of the wild man. And the wild man typically is giant, covered with hair, and interestingly enough, he always carries a club of some kind, or some kind of broken stick or tree branch. These are all like medieval paintings and all. The wild man shows up in literature. Practically anybody in high school had to read Beowulf, probably. And of course, the story of Beowulf is you've got Grendel. He comes in, Grendel lives out in the sticks. He comes into Hrothgar's mead hall and eats his drunken soldiers at night. And so Hrothgar is losing his army to this monster that comes in. Lauren Coleman talks about Grendel being this primate type creature, which may be true, but in the text it talks about Grendel having scales. So who knows? You might have an early lizard man on their hands. Who knows? Another time this wild kind of man creature shows up in literature is, we're all familiar with King Arthur to some degree or not, but one of the stories that shows up in King Arthur's literature that shows up over and over and over again is when he battles the giant of Mont Saint-Michel. And it's this giant who is coming down from his mountain, and he's killing people and eating them and that type of thing. And in this one scene that, again, shows up in stories over and over again, is where King Arthur goes, he's got a sword, he's got his armor on that represents that he's of society. He lives in this civil world. And he goes in and encounters the giant. The giant is sitting there, eating something, and he's got grease on his hands, and he just kind of rubs it on his face and his beard, and he's burping and spitting and that type of thing, and he just no manners at all, And so you have this immediate contrast between, civilization and lack of civilization. And so in all of these stories, the giant always sort of represents that baser nature. Oh, and there's also this contrast in this story of the club and the sword. That he's got the club just like the wild man always does, but it's real clumsy, and he just kind of throws it around, that type of thing. Whereas Arthur is very nimble with his, and he can do fancy moves and stuff. And it's just that contrast between civilized man and uncivilized man. It shows up over and over again. In England, if you are looking at a wild man, he tends to have that contrast that I just talked about, the society versus the wilderness. In Germany, if you capture a wild man, he will evidently impart knowledge of some kind to you. In the Eastern world, the wild man tends to be some disruptive element that needs to be eliminated. So, if you capture one, you kill it. In Europe, you have, just like in Native American culture, you have this motif of the wild man kidnapping the maiden, and you have tons of these pictures of wild man coming in and taking the maiden, and she's grabbing onto the tree, she doesn't want to be taken, and this just shows up over and over and over again. It becomes this kind of cautionary tale of don't let your woman wander into the woods by herself, and this bugbear hypothesis, this has to do with it's sort of a category of folklore where it's a story that you tell the children, or in this case your wife, to tell them not to wander off. So Hansel and Gretel is a cautionary tale. You don't wander into the woods because the witch will put you in her oven. I think the wild man kind of becomes this. Don't let your woman wander away. And so then you have this image of this kind of degraded humanity. This gets kind of interspersed with stories of werewolves, and I just threw in that it kind of reminds me of the Dogman account. I don't know a ton about the Dogman. I just kind of recently discovered stuff about it, started listening to podcasts about it. But it seems very werewolfy, which seems very wild man-y. If that's an adjective. I teach English, so I can make up words. The wild man shows up in fine arts. You've got these watercolors and paintings and woodcuts. First off, of course, you've got the wild man covered with hair with his club. In this German painting, again, you have the knight with the sword fighting the wild man with the club. And a lot of times you have this little juvenile kind of hanging onto his leg. I'm not really sure what's going on there. Get back to you on that one. Same thing with the German woodcut. Wild man is definitely a church architecture. So you've got the green man going on, as we talked about, but you also have the wild man as well. And here typically the wild man there's a group of snowmen, a whole group that they evidently inebriated and captured, and they killed them. In Nepal, you have the Sing Sing, or the Shoko. This is really weird. The human face, pink body, is capable of speaking. But this can also be captured if lured with then you have the wild men of East Africa. These are sort of these pygmy versions of wild men. Long arms and short legs with hairy red bodies, who are also extremely fond of alcohol. Even weirder than that is this other motif that shows up in wild men in other cultures, is that their feet are backwards. And so the idea, you've got this as a consistent theme, and also the idea is when they run, or you see their tracks, you think, well, I'm getting out of here, but instead of running away from them, you're actually running toward them. So they can trick you that way. So there's a medieval drawing of one with his legs backwards, and then you've got this Brazilian creature called the Curupira. And as far as what that represents or means or whatever, it seems to indicate lack of, or the idea of degeneration or devolution, as opposed to evolution. Sort of this idea of going backwards. And so you have a couple of different cultures that have the same thing: West Africa, Ireland, and Switzerland, China, Guatemala. All these different stories of wild men or creatures with backwards feet. I just thought it was really weird. All right, so that's the hairy man and the wild man and the green man, and now I want to talk about some historical accounts, just to show the consistency of this thing. And of course, we've talked about various names, whether it's Sasquatch, Liew, whatever. And we've talked about, last night they were talking some about the variant sizes and hair colors and that kind of thing, whether it's different species or just, where you are geographically determining what color your hair is or whatever. And possibly even different species. You've got the patty types that are more ape-like. Then you have this Neanderthal-looking type. And then you have reports of dog men, and even down where I come from, the lizard man. So all kind of under the umbrella of Bigfoot, and sort of the commonality of them all, of course, is this idea of a mysterious, undiscovered species of bipedal creature. They all kind of fall into that. So if we go back, and this is the Western world, I'm not considering the Eastern world because I can't cover the whole world in one lecture, but or heretical. Back into the medieval period, Beowulf is the most famous of all the medieval stuff, but it comes from Germanic tales that preceded it. So this was a constant theme of the monster coming in from nowhere or the outskirts to bother those in society. So Beowulf was not the first story like that, but it comes from all these sort of wild man tales from Germanic tribes. You find the wild man in legend, art, and architecture. So there you've got it in architecture, and this trunk and then watercolor. And here they're, they capture two wild men and they're throwing them into the fire, probably for stealing their wives. And you can see in that, on the, it's kind of hard to see, but on that trunk, these two wild men are talking to this maiden. They're trying to sort of lure her. Let's go hang out in the woods. Another weird thing about the medieval period is bestiaries, which are sort of these encyclopedias of weird creatures that they would do. And you might find things that actually existed, but they're also like griffins and unicorns and stuff like that. And so it's kind of hard to tell what was real and what was not. And you've got a wild man down there. But these ones on the right, the primates tend to be the troublesome ones. And so here you've got a primate frat party. It's hard to see, but they're actually drinking beer from a barrel. And down here you've got this guy, he's stabbing them, getting them out, telling them to leave. So it's kind of like the get them out because they're troublesome. Just a nod to the Vikings who are around this period, who come to the New World, and Leif Erikson talks about these huge hairy men that live in the woods. They smell bad, they have this deafening shriek. And so that's one of the earliest accounts of, or maybe the earliest account of Bigfoot in the New World. One of the neat things about the Vikings is they would carve these faces. They would have green men in their architecture too, but they would also carve, so you have green man, Viking green men, with the foliage coming out of their mouth and their eyes and all that stuff. But they would also do these carvings of Viking warriors with their tongues coming out and doing like this. And what that was the previous generation imparting knowledge to the next generation and in speaking knowledge. So that's what that mouth is. So it uses the same motif as the green man, taking the leaves out of his mouth to sort of talk about nature and all. And so it's kind of hard to tell when you see this architecture what's a green man and what's a Viking warrior, but it's the same kind of motif. That's being at Disney World, not in Norway. But it's neat that there's a green man or Viking, whatever, in Disney World. In the 1500s, you have, especially as Europeans started to sort of wander the world, and you have this different accounts of things. This hairy man captured in the Canary Islands. This Antonio Pigafetta, who sailed with Magellan, talks about these giants with huge feet and bull-like voices that they encountered in Patagonia. The 1700s, you have this guy, Admiral John Byron, talks about this 9-foot race of men, not just one character, but a whole group of men, beings in Patagonia. And in southern Argentina, in the 1700s, there are reports of savage beings, giant in stature. So this just shows up over and over and over again. And again, it might not all be what we think of Bigfoot, but it's certainly along the same category. Also in the 1700s, you've got a guy named Paul Bartholomew, who appears in, we've got Small Town Monsters represented here. In Seth Breedlove's Beast of Whitehall movie, Paul Bartholomew appears. And really interesting historian. He's a commentator of the movie. But he's written a couple of books about Bigfoot and all. And he talks about this account of the French and Indian War where soldiers saw Bigfoots. And then once you get into the colonial period, it's just like hard and fast. They're all over the place. This is just a little bit of them. And in all the states, practically, that Europeans wander into, they see swamp dwellers or big feet or Bigfoots or wild men or whatever. I think Russell had that same stamp there with the Sasquatch in it. Still in the 1800s, you've got this artist named Paul Kane, who was sort of this pioneer / artist who painted a lot of North America during the 1800s. And he's hanging around in Mount St. Helens, and he says in one of his diaries Mount St. Helens has never been visited either by whites or Indians. The latter assert that it is inhabited by a race of beings of different species who are cannibals and whom they hold in great dread. And so Mount St. Helens is so inundated with Bigfoot that you have this travel poster that calls Mount St. Helens Bigfoot country. Tommy, who's also a South Carolinian, we were talking, I think yesterday, was asking if he wondered if the Bigfoots knew that if Mount St. Helens was going to erupt, if they kind of split for a little while and came back or whatever. Be interesting to know. By the 1800s, you start to have the capacity to print lots of things very quickly, and so you end up with newspaper accounts of all these, rather than them being like orally passed down from one generation to the next. You start having, hey, we have a wild man living in our swamp or whatever. So you start having these articles show up, and with illustrations and forensic sketches. This really strange book called Sea and Land. It comes out in 1889. That is literally a list of different ways to be killed while you're traveling around the world. And very funny, weird book. But one of the ways is to be kidnapped by a wild man. And there is a wild man with his staff or his club stealing a woman away. And around the turn of the century, there's a historian named Graham Joyner who said he found 29 references to the Australian Yowie. So this is going on not only in North America, but also in Australia, and of course all over the place. But between 1824 and 1935, he finds 29 references in newspapers to the Yowie, which I thought was pretty cool. And that really brings us up to sort of the 20th century, where you start to get real familiar information, whether it's John Burns or Abe Canyon or the Shipton photo, Sanderson, Patterson Gimlin, John Green, and all these that are sort of icons in our little subculture here. I was doing some research on a completely different topic, studying Hitler's Germany, and I found this, just as a little aside, that I thought was really strange. The Nazi Party had this task force called the Unternabe, and their job was to go find proof that the Aryan race was superior. And part of that proof, it's a longer story, but they wanted to go find the Yeti in Tibet. And so this is as early as 1938 or 39. Hitler sends Ernst Schaefer, a zoologist, to go to Tibet and try to find the Yeti. I just thought it was weird. And that really brings us up to today, where Bigfoot is very much in our popular culture. He's been in our sort of racial collective conscious forever, but now he's on our beer and our pizzas and our comic books and TV shows and that kind of thing. And whether that's a great thing or not, that's arguable. I don't know. I think it's kind of neat. It's on Pokemon cards and all kinds of stuff. I think the proliferation of the idea of Bigfoot is kind of big because it tends to make it more acceptable, maybe, but I think it does have a tendency to be made fun of, perhaps. But that kind of brings us up to where we are today. Now, in a moment of shameless promotion, some of my friends and I are working on this book called Bigfoot Manifestations of a Mystery. At least that's our working title. Which is going to be a case book of Bigfoot stuff. And so I just want to go through real quickly some of the stuff that's in that. We hope to have it published in the coming year, but I'm going to provide an introduction and then a chapter that's going to be real similar to this talk about folklore and all. Kenneth Jabolski, some of these people you will know, I'm sure, who's going to talk about ethnology. We have Seth Breedlove, who's Wonderful Parents. Might still be here. They had to leave, but Seth is the guy behind Small Town Monsters, and he's going to talk about the new media's influence. There's Shannon LeGros, who does the Into the Fray. She's done several other podcasts, but right now she does the Into the Fray podcast, and she's going to write about the paranormal aspect of this. We got Mark Matsky, who's on the Sasquatch podcast, and also does a a great podcast with his son called Monsterland, Ohio, and he's going to talk about some cultural aspects. We have Nicole Law, who's going to talk about evolutionary theory. That's not Nicole, she's a lot prettier than that. I couldn't find a picture of her. We have Russ Jones, who just published this book, Tracking the Stone Man. He's in the BFRO, and this is going to talk about field research. We have Dr. Kelly Timms, who's a criminologist from Appalachian State, and she's going to talk about social factors and research. And then we have our friend Joe back there, who is going to, of course, the author of Monster Trek, copies of which are available in the back of the room. He's going to talk about some media coverage as far as this goes. So that is our sort of planned project for the coming year. So hopefully that'll be available at some point soon. That is all I have. So thank you.